I've spoken about what I see as the flaws, or perhaps the problems, the moral problems with the Christian or traditional Christian vision of hell, i.e., an eternal damnation to somewhere that is utterly horrible and unbearable, where you spend eternity. Now, that isn't the only version or vision of hell that exists out there, of course. And I'm intrigued by the ones that deal with things like temporary or limited hells. Contemporaneous with the emergence of Christianity, and even competitive to it, was the emergence of Mithraism. And from my understanding of the Mithraic cosmology, there was a hell, which I believe was a permanent hell, but God, Mithras, visited there 3 times every day, whatever that means in the span of eternity, to shake his mace at the demons in hell to make sure that they only tormented people as badly as they deserved. Now, that is kind of a strange idea, but it at least says that there are some limits to the amount of punishment that should be meted out. My understanding, again, of the Islamic hell is that it may be permanent, but there's always a tiny straw of possibility of coming out, of being redeemed from hell, even in the span of eternity, if there's one tiny iota of goodness, of faith, of possible redemption in your soul, which, if you ask me, means that anyone who ends up tossed into hell is just getting a, as it were, spanking, because inevitably people are going to realize once they're down there that, well, this really isn't the way that I want to spend eternity. That strikes me as a much more humane idea than the conventional Christian one. Although even there are echoes of the problem, the moral problems raised by the existence of an eternal hell, eternal punishment. It was a while back, I think the Vatican or the papacy or a pope or something like this stated that it's entirely possible that hell, which does definitely exist, is empty and will remain empty forever. That's an interesting point of view, in that it's just held up as some sort of example of, I suppose, reductio ad damnatio, of what happens to someone who is fully sinful, utterly sinful. This is where they go, even though it's virtually impossible for a human being to be quite that evil. That's the way I read that. The most fascinating one, the most fascinating vision of hell, to me, is the Hindu one, or one would say, I suppose, the Vedic one, or even, I suppose, the Indic one, because this hell involves Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism, and whatever other faiths follow the idea of karma, dharma, and samsara, i.e., duty, action or experience, and the eternal wheel of existence, i.e., reincarnation. Where my understanding of these is, hell is where you put yourself. And the second you realize that you're in hell is the second that you start to slowly but surely climb out of it. It can be instantaneous. It can take the space of thousands, millions of lifetimes to get out of there. But eventually, through your own efforts, you can crawl back out. It depends on how far you have become obscured to the reality of our natural condition, which is the exact opposite of hell. It still kind of doesn't have me convinced 100%, because it's such a gigantic model, a cosmological model, that it's very, very, very difficult to wrap one's head around, and it tends to blow the mind, which I suppose it was intended to do in the first place, like so much of the religious thinking that began in the Indian subcontinent. So hell in and of itself is not necessarily, to my mind, a completely insane concept. It just depends on what your vision of it is. I can see people being in their own personal hell. I think I've experienced it. I can only imagine, say, for example, studying it as I have, imagining someone withdrawing from heroin, a heroin addiction. That must be hell itself. Someone who is, as I say, an 18th century West Indian slave, or someone in Auschwitz is in hell. It's the closest thing we can possibly get to hell on earth, where you're physically suffering and you're spiritually suffering in utter anguish. So it's not enough, I think, to just sort of denounce one narrow vision of hell, because in a way we blind ourselves to the fact that something akin to what we describe as hell could possibly exist. And I like to examine that. It need not be permanent, and it can actually, in the grand scheme of things, be just, but only in the grand scheme of things, reflect the ultimate justice of the universe. It's just a thought, and it's a take actually on the problem of evil, I suppose, or what one might call the problem of suffering. That's the way the Buddha put it. Suffering is real, therefore something akin to hell is at least apparently real, if not eternally. Thank you.